Okay, thank you. So we're going to bring Duff out in a moment and have a conversation, but one of the things I'm glad that you did was kind of remind us of the poetry and markets and the beauty of markets. And, oh, okay, here, why don't you sit in the middle and I'll sit here. And I think what the trouble is something that you talked about, and we've heard this language come up many times, particularly we heard it during the election and such. And I think the idea is that there is something very efficient and beautiful about markets, and that they can be very good in allocating goods, but the feeling that the system is rigged. Right. And you heard that, we've heard it in many different contexts, certainly during the political election. And so how do we, if it seems when you talk about restoring faith, how do we get first to unrig the system and then get people to believe it?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think in part the answer is, when you see things that looked rigged, that typically is the absence of markets, right? So if you think about large technology companies that are coming to dominate spaces where people are really concerned, that's the absence of markets. If you think about the monopoly power of legislators to be able to control resources at different times, that's the absence of markets. So, and again, I'm not trying to tell you that it's the be-all and end-all, but the last several decades, and even today, we have talked ourselves into a frenzy when unemployment's below 5%. I understand median wages are flat, and we have to fix that. But we are going to do some really stupid things if we don't come to appreciate that there are a lot of things that are going fine. And in fact, markets are helping a lot. Obviously, to really unrig it, we have to think seriously about campaign finance reform. We have to kind of seriously think about gerrymandering. The two most recent Supreme Court cases on those things are our best hope for doing that. That's the way forward. Markets aren't going to fix everything. We need a state to say, we need the courts to say enough. Mm-hmm. That's the best hope, I think.
Mm-hmm. Duff, what's your take on that?
In the context of my book, which is about what they're teaching at business schools, I think one of the reasons we've gotten into the situation we're in today is that there was a bit of an abdication on their part about there is no one true form of capitalism. There are many varieties of capitalism. There's the German, there is the Japanese. I don't know what you want to call China. It's sort of a hybrid. But even among the Western-ish nations, there's three very distinct flavors. And yet in the United States, I think most business schools have simply assumed our form of capitalism and not done enough questioning of it, and not questioned the structures that might lead us to be rigged, particularly in Washington, as Mihir says, and are instead focused more on maybe not the economics or policy people, but about how to optimize your own potential within that system. And I think their job is actually more to step back and say, is this system the right system? And I don't think they do enough of that.
I mean, one thing, and it's come up in a lot of the panels over the last 2 days about looking, systemically at the system as opposed to individuals. At the same time, though, again and again, we see instances of whether it's securities fraud, which is what brought down some of these companies, in so many different instances. I remember the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, which the idea was it's supposed to be this cautionary tale of greed. And as I understood it, there were a lot of young guys coming out of business school or not thinking wow, that's who I want to be.
I think the same thing happened with Wall Street, the movie.
Right.
A generation
greed is
ago.
Good.
Yeah.
And so this perhaps gets into a whole other topic of human nature, but to the degree to which you said there are limits to regulation, and I agree with that because we've seen regulation sometimes have effects that nobody anticipated that are worse. Yet, how do we deal with this kind of fundamental problem?
The fundamental problem of bad behavior, right? So I think first it's worthwhile just acknowledging that it's been around forever. So one of my favorite quotes in the book is from 1688 and from the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Joseph de la Vega writes in Confusión de Confusiones, he basically calls finance the most vulgar business in the world and the most wonderful business in the world. the one that's most filled with ideas, and the one that's just bereft of anything. It's a contradiction. Like many things in life, there is good and there is bad. What we've seen recently in the last 3 decades is, especially in finance, more bad than good. And I think that's because people in finance have gotten lost in spreadsheets and screens, and they have got disconnected from the humanity of what they do. And that is what the humanities do. They reconnect you to the humanity of what your decisions are. And we've just lost that. And the cycle or the equilibrium we're in, which is then people get more angry, they expect even less, and these people behave even worse. They partition their lives so their personal lives are separate, they can behave well, but their professional lives are whatever they are. That's a terrible equilibrium to be in. I think we have to make it aspirational again. And that, I think, is really hard. But I think that's the thing. If we're going to blame, I think, the business school setting for that kind of greed, I think that's possible. We should just understand that it's, omnipresent in different kinds of sectors in the economy. Bad behavior that one might have attributed to business schools are showing up in the film industry. They're showing up in all kinds of places. That doesn't make it more acceptable. But I don't know if we should think that it's something unique. And I think, to my last point, I think it reflects something larger about a degradation of the way we think about the world, which we could try to address better, for sure. But I don't think we should expect it to be a cure-all.
Yeah, I don't think business schools have a monopoly on poor morals. But there's certainly they have significant market share in some of the corporate stuff.
See, you're learning to talk.
There you go. So one thing I think, on the opposite side of the solution spectrum there, Mihir's book is about returning us to a sense of higher purpose. I think another alternative, which has been talked about for years and we just don't do, is harsher sentencing penalties for corporate and white-collar fraud. Like, if you want to return someone to an understanding of their core humanity, put them in prison. And I just think that's, it's staring us right in the face. We don't do it. We send people to jail for street crimes forever, and we, send them to country club, whatever, for securities fraud in the hundreds of millions of dollars. What's the phrase? If you rob a bank, you.
Yeah.
It doesn't help for small crime. It doesn't help for a white collar. So I'm not saying morally it would be outrage and put people in prison. That's okay. But as a deterrent, it has not yet proven to work out.
Well,
Even the death penalty.
Yes, however, counterfactual. Like, let's jack up the white-collar crimes for finance and sort of stock-driven crimes, and just let's see what happens if we sentence them to the same amount of time as crack possession.
So can I just, one quick thing on this, which is first, I think you're right, and Jesse Eisenger's recent book, The Chicken Shit Club, is amazing on this. Having said that, I think Dan has a point, which is that there are a lot of counterproductive things that can happen when you deter people in these ways. There's a whole system at work. So think about Sarbanes-Oxley, what we tried to do at the beginning of the 2000s. We tried to increase penalties on companies if they misrepresented what they said. Well, what did they do? They said less, and they ended up going private, and that led in part to the private equity boom, which has led to its own set of issues. So this is a really delicate system, and I think it's this delicate system of a principal-agent problem where capital's got to move from you to companies. And there are no simple solutions to that. That is the nature of modern capitalism. And there's always going to be behaviors along the way that we can be upset with. That is part of what it is.
Right. There is an interesting phenomenon, and when people look at behavioral economics and its psychology, and I guess that was one of the points in terms of regulation, that sometimes it causes unintended effects. It's interesting, let's say, tax fraud. Whenever there's a change in terms of what you have to report, let's say one deduction goes down, suddenly they notice, the next year deductions for some other category go up, and we have that. Do you think perhaps if that kind of deterrence is not as effective, what about incentives? Because it seems a lot of the system, whether it's the tax, and we seem to be doubling down on that, in fact, that are creating incentives for the wrong things.
Yeah, I wasn't aware till I was working on my book about Bill Clinton's role in the stock option boom, and I make the point in the Annals of Unintended Consequences. He tried to cap executive salaries at $1 million, and what resulted was fine. Well, first of all, it didn't even lower the average salary because it was below $1 million, and it converged right up to it. It's like, oh, that's the new max, and then stock options, like
Right.
So. I don't have the policy prescription for how to deter excessive pay or excessive or like a focus on accounting fraud or the like. But I think we have to do all of them.
Well, just on that point, I happen to have taught that section 162 of the code. And what Clinton did was not just cap it, but he actually excluded performance-based compensation, as you know. So that was like even more of a push in that direction. But to your point, I think these problems are hard, right? So I think a lot about tax policy, and it's easy to say corporations should pay their fair share. That feels like a nice thing to say. It's a fairly meaningless thing to say. What do we know? We know that all kinds of people bear the corporate tax, workers, shareholders, and moreover, we know that it's a complex problem. So if you run Google, you can locate your profits anywhere in the world, like this. It's like not hard to do. And I'm not saying what they do is good, but we should just understand the responsibilities of the person who's thinking about that problem. It's not reasonable just to say, pay your fair share. I mean, they have operations around the world. They have employees from around the world. It's actually a really hard and subtle problem.
Right, which I guess goes back to the point that, Duff, you were talking about. Is there a way, again, going back to the structural issue, to basically include incentives for doing the right thing, whether it's for, there's been attempts, let's say, for environmental, in the environmental realm, where you could kind of sell your pollution credits. But the idea of, is there a way to structure, whether it's a tax incentive or corporations, that you actually increase the incentive, make that part of the structure to take, whether it's your workers, as you were talking about, Duff, in your
I would
formula.
say, one place to start there is with boards of directors. Like, that is the most colossal failure of responsibility that we have had in our time. I call it in my book the most intricately designed circle jerk in financial history. Like, there are CEOs on other CEOs' boards and compensation committees setting, blah, 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 blah. It's like, can we do the right thing? How hard is it to do the right thing? I don't know. Maybe we do need to build incentives in because it's too hard? I don't know. What do you think?
I think, I think it's hard to top that. But yeah, so...
That was that aggressive tone in the book that people objected to.
Look, I think it's clear that we're failing on some margins, but again, there are a lot of unintended consequences. So I'm concerned when people start talking about, corporations should have a social mission. We have, CSR has now become the latest kind of fig leaf we allow people to dress themselves in, and it's not altogether that helpful, and it leads to a lot of diffused priorities, and it leads to a lot of kind of shenanigans. So I'm a cranky old man, which is I think firms and markets are good for what they do. If you want to do things like have governments provide services, let's do it. Let's fund it well. That's great. The notion that companies are going to provide all these moral goods for everybody, I think it's fantastical. I think that's what I meant, which I said we're expecting way too much in many ways.
And it might just come back to education too. Like,
Yeah,
why do we do what we do? Like, this conversation should happen everywhere. And then maybe people will remember, why am I doing what I'm doing?
And I wish we could continue it, but we're out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.